വരുന്നുണ്ട്. Hello everybody, welcome to this edition of literary criticism. Now, yeah, I hope that you are reading your literary criticism well. Yesterday we had IA Richards. We've got the whole series on videos now. Exams are also coming near, so you need to brush up your videos, look into the videos, read well, and get very good marks. And when you get good marks, you need to tell us. So today, Dr. Prasanth will take us through F.R. Leavis. Thank you, Dr. Prasanth, for coming in. Over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Premanand. Welcome all of you to this edition of Literary Criticism, the prescribed paper for the 4th semester BA English, and it also accounts for the 6th semester BA, though this particular writer is not there in your syllabus. Naturally, an understanding or getting a chronological perspective on literature will be highly beneficial for you. So we will just look at the contributions made by F.R. Leavis. There is only one entry in your syllabus, that is concept of literature and criticism. So straight away we proceed to F.R. Leavis. So he was just like I.A. Richards, educated at, he was born actually in Cambridge province, and he was educated there, and later he took up his assignment as a teacher there for some time. And then he continued to work in a Downing College for another 30 years of his life. And like Richards, he too had a vast experience of classroom teaching. And he married his former student, Queenie Dorothy, with whom he brought out many of his books in criticism. So it turned out to be a very productive relationship in the personal level as well as in the literary level. And you can broadly categorize I.F.R. Leavis stages of his critical acumen, or maybe critical over, into 4 different perspectives, or maybe stages, you can say. And the first, naturally, to do with his poetic output or poetry output. And this particular book is very, very significant, new bearings in English poetry, actually, though the title in your book is written as New Bearings in Poetry, it is New Bearings in English Poetry. So it is published in 1932. And this, I think, is a very basic text for understanding writers of 20th century. Maybe if you go for PG, post-graduation in English, this will be one of the first books you read to understand the poetry of the 20th century. Very well written, argumentative book. I will not say it is, he has put forward a great kind of evaluation, but rather taking into account the fact that this particular work was composed shortly after, almost 10-15 years after the Wasteland was published. When you look at from this particular point of view of historical perspective, I think this book has done much justice to the poetry of Eliot, Yeats, Pound, and Hopkins. Then in the second phase, he has taken up fiction. And you have another very important work, The Great Tradition, published in 1948. In the third phase, he moved to social and educational issues. And the last or fourth stage, he became more and more philosophical with works like The Living Principle, English as a Discipline of Thought, published in 1975. And out of these 4 stages, I think we will be focusing on the first 2 stages. That is, as a poet, a critic of poetry, and as a critic of fiction. Fiction was a new reality, as you understand. We had drama and poetry right from beginning, and novel was a very latest edition, almost came into prominence in the 20th century or late 19th century. We had the first novels appearing in 19th century, second part of 19th century, and you have writers like Thomas Hardy coming up in late 19th century, and maybe in the first 25 years of 20th century, we have writers like Joseph Conrad, D.H. Lawrence, and others. And of course, you also have earlier writers like Jane Austen and other Victorian writers. So he had actually applied himself as a critic to evaluate fiction, which was a new reality with respect to English literature. And he agreed with Matthew Arnold that literature is a criticism of life. I think F.R. Leavis has his affinity with T.S. Eliot on one hand and with Matthew Arnold on the other. So they were his immediate predecessors who came just before F.R. Leavis. So he has great respect, and maybe to great extent he echoes the views put forth by Matthew Arnold, who said criticism is a literature is a criticism of life, critical of materialism of the age, exactly like I.A. Richards and Matthew Arnold. He was a critique of the materialistic concern of the age, when people or men are greedy after money and material possession. He was a little skeptical about his or maybe the man's aspiration for materialistic entities. And he said he believed that literature has a historical and moral responsibility to society. My slide, you have to have a space after a historical. It is written a historical, should be a historical. Literature has a historical and a moral responsibility. Where I think he comes closer to the classics, like he becomes a kind of a moralist, which you cannot approve in the 20th century. So 20th century literary theory is a personal. It is not personal something. So when you apply a moral yardstick, when you apply a didactic element, you become somewhat a kind of a classic where you prescribe rules and regulations for literature. So in this respect, I think he is more uh, belonging to the past or classic. He is more of a classicist. So he believes that there is a historical and moral responsibility for literature to take care of the society, or to shape the society or build the society. And he used the word enactment. By using the word enactment, he meant a work of literature acts as a moral sentiment rather than expressing it by means of words. So he does not look upon a literary text with its text value, meaning he does not consider literature or a poem or a novel as a book of words, but rather he looks upon any literary text, whether it is poetry or drama or novel, as expressing a moral sentiment. There should be a moral concern for literature. I think here he stands closer to Matthew Arnold and maybe a bit closer to Aristotle, maybe. And he, again, like a classicist, he asserted the artistic sincerity. What do you mean by artistic sincerity is that you have to express an emotion or a feeling only after you actually feel it. Meaning, you can write about Kashmir if you had been to Kashmir. You cannot write about Kashmir without being to Kashmir. It lacks a sincerity, an author sincerity or artistic sincerity. So, F.R. Leavis firmly asserted that writers should have a artistic sincerity on one level. No aesthetics which is not connected to ethics is literature. Any literary aesthetic is closely associated with or linked with the ethics in literature. So any literary piece, whether poetry, fiction, or drama, should have ethics. Our writers should uphold the ethics in literature. Ethics is embedded in the form of work of art. In any work of art, what is embedded beyond the words, beyond the language, beyond the theme, and also expression is the ethics, which is embedded in the form of, in a texturous form, it is embedded or maybe decoded, encoded in the literary piece. He also criticized Victorian poetry like Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold criticized Victorian poetry for being materialistic. But he criticized, F.R. Leavis criticized Victorian poetry for separating thought and feeling. And thought and feeling, as Eliot observed, he maintained the word a dissociation of sensibility. And F.R. Leavis follows Eliot when he uh, accuses or finds fault with Victorian poetry for separating or for creating a dissociation of sensibility. And he also agreed with Eliot that metaphysical poetry, that I'm coming to in the next paragraph, concept of literature largely determined by his appreciation of culture and literature in the 17th and 18th century. He was an ardent appreciator. He appreciated, worshipped the 17th and 18th century poetry, especially the metaphysical poetry, which was earlier appreciated by T.S. Eliot. And T.S. Eliot believed that only metaphysical poetry had a unified sensibility. After metaphysical poetry, there is a dissociation of sensibility, which F.R. Leavis also underlines and says that it is true. The observations made by Eliot is true. That 17th century beginning, where we had metaphysical school of writers, you had a unified sensibility, a blend of thought and feeling, which Eliot calls unified sensibility. Study of literature would increase the quality of life in testing times. So he believed that because the world is going through a very tough time, because you understand that between 1914 and 17 or maybe 18, we had the First World War. And once the First World War was over, it was one thing was very certain that there will be another war very soon. But of course, we had to wait up to 1942 for that. So between, F.R. Leavis lived between the two wars. So it was a troubled time. It was a time of great uh, uncertainty, just like what we have now with the epidemic spreading out like anything. So he believed that literature would be a solace, would provide a comfort to the troubling or troubled times, or maybe the testing times. The Great Tradition is the name of the book that he published. A class of literature which he called the Great Tradition. What is the Great Tradition? You remember your Matthew Arnold talking about Testone. So a great tradition should be introduced to younger generation through education. So he believed that to have good writers, you should make them teach classics. Only if they come in terms with a great tradition of literature, then only they can generate or bring out good literature themselves. So teaching young generation, young scholars, young writers about the great tradition is something which is very much inevitable as far as F.R. Leavis is concerned. He was a practical critic, like I. Richards, in the sense that his critical practice began in his classrooms. As I told you in the first slide, he had almost 30 long years of teaching experience as a teacher in college. So many of his assumptions, many of his theories, I'm not very sure. I won't say that he has a particular theory to contribute, but the observations, I would say, his observations are rather modeled on or maybe contrived from the classroom teaching experience he had as a professor or as a teacher in college. He favored the close reading of the text that he extended to novel. Maybe if you ask me what is the biggest contribution of F.R. Leavis is that just like other writers or other critics of his contemporary critics, he too advocated a close reading of the text. And initially, I told you in my last presentation that majority of these critics adopted a close reading of the text with respect to poetry. But the goodness in F.R. Leavis is that he had extended this close reading to novels as well. So, biggest contribution of F.R. Leavis is in his evaluation of novels, fiction. His moral and didactic fervor or affinity distanced him from formalism and new criticism. And these two schools we are going to look at in our next class, right? Formalism and new criticism. And both these schools advocated a close reading of the text. And F.R. Leavis at one point stands closer to them with respect to close reading of the text, but on a different he distanced himself from, or new criticism and formalism distanced from F.R. Leavis. He firmly believed that literature is a criticism of life, which that we made in the beginning, and the critic should assess the moral position in the work. So that also is his position. He has to assume a moral position when he evaluate a work of art, which is against all the modern criticism. Because after F.R. Leavis, we have formalism, new criticism, structuralism. All these literary theory, they reject the subjective position. And F.R. Leavis will be the last subjective critic who speaks about a critic having a moral perspective or a moral position when you go through the evaluation of a particular work. It is the duty of the critic to identify the great works of literature, which we called the great tradition in the previous slide. He should have a power to analyze the work. The last point we made, there should be a moral position with which he analyzes a work of art. He should look into the organization and the structure of the work and ensure the unity of thought and emotion. And he is naturally termed as a magisterial critic. Magisterial critic is just like a magistrate. What is the duty of a magistrate? Listen to the case and pass a verdict. So he was more like a magistrate, passing absolute verdict. Once the verdict is passed on, nobody can reverse. Maybe you have to approach the higher court for acquitting yourself. So he was something like a magistrate, passing verdict on certain people, right? Which I think 20th century criticism did not at all appreciate, right? So any school of criticism after F.R. Leavis never appreciated this kind of a judgmental criticism. But he was the last critic to have a magisterial criticism, passing absolute verdicts, at times categorical, even aggressive, right? At times it is categorical, at times it is aggressive. So any verdict is categorical. You cannot have a very fair judgment every time because you can never understand both the sides. And aggressive because you have to be aggressive when you pass a judgment. So he was the last critic, perhaps, to believe that the role of a critic is to judge. Actually, the role of a critic is not to judge. So you even have teachers who believe that the duty of a teacher is to judge or evaluate. It is not the responsibility of a teacher to evaluate. Teacher has to motivate the students to be very precise, right? Evaluation is only part of the duty, definitely, but that is not the major duty. So similarly, in criticism, F.R. Leavis believed that it is the duty of a critic to judge. And coming to my last slide, he was influenced first by Eliot, new bearings in English poetry. He attacked the Victorian poetry and proclaimed the importance of Eliot, Pound, and Hopkins. This point I made it clear in the first slide itself. In Revaluation, Tradition and Development in English Poetry, published 1936, he extended his survey of English poetry back to 17th century. This also I said in the first slide, that he had taken a survey of 18th and 17th century poetry. In 40s, his interest moved to novel, The Great Tradition, published in 48. Where he makes a reassessment of English fiction, proclaiming or almost ushering forward Jane Austen, George Eliot, Conrad, and Henry James, who were actually really not paid much attention to, and as great novelist. And also he was an ardent supporter of D.H. Lawrence, who I said yesterday that his novels were actually burned in public. So he was the first writer, perhaps, to identify the genuinity or greatness in the writer D.H. Lawrence. And other books published by him, Anna Karenina, and other essays. Another book that he has published was Dickens, the novelist, and more important work, Common Pursuit. So what we expect as a essay question from him, short questions from F.R. Leavis is the name of his books, especially New Bearings in English Poetry, and the last one I said, The Common Pursuit. So you have to keep in mind that the two books there. So with that, we come to the end of the presentation. Now we move to the questions. I have 15 questions for you marked. And yeah, I have asked specific questions on what is his first book on poetry, that is New Bearings in English Poetry, and what is his work in fiction, that is a great tradition. And all such questions I've included in this particular questionnaire. So we can just quickly glance through the questions I have, take a screenshot of it, and you remember that you have only one concept of FR Leavis. So we don't expect a essay question from FR Leavis. And coming to the paragraph question, we have 4 questions on FR Leavis: critical phases, as a criticism of life, assessment of Leavis as a critic, his observations on poetry and fiction. I think question 3 and 4 are almost, you have the identical answers, right? Though I worded it differently, I think you have to answer the same way for question 3 and question 4. So thank you for today. So this is a shortest, perhaps the shortest syllabus you have for FR Leavis, and we will be back with the next set of writers. I think it is new criticism or it is formalism. We'll be back with formalism tomorrow. Over to you, Dr. Premanand.
Thank you, Dr. Prasanth. And as today is being one of the shortest video, isn't it? Hope that you will study today also and be thorough with the 19th and 20th century. We have now gone through a gamut of centuries. I hope that you will be you'll watch the videos, read the book, and get very good marks for us. So thank you very much. Till tomorrow. Bye.